Tonight I would like to present some work I carried out for my PhD thesis, which, as John said, looks at the relationship between the rapid and far-reaching military and economic developments of the late classical and Hellenistic periods. This relationship is, of course, much discussed, especially in terms of the perceived correlation between military activity and increased monetization. In my PhD, I look at the relationship from a labor history perspective and question whether soldiers in paid military service can be seen as wage labourers, the presence of whom is traditionally associated with the emergence of market economies. Thus, by conceiving of these soldiers as a large-scale instance of wage labour, I hope to illustrate their importance as agents of socio-economic change and present a model via which the economic and military developments of the period can be related. I shall outline the broad strokes of the research, beginning with an introduction to the military and economic developments, followed by a discussion of the concept of wage labour and its relevance to the ancient world. Subsequently, I shall discuss the extent to which soldiers in the armies of Philip and Alexander and those of the successors can indeed be seen as an instance of large-scale wage labour. Paid military service, of course, existed beyond the royal armies, but not on the same scale, hence a choice of focus. In particular, I shall discuss the composition of the armies by types of enlistment and ensuing terms of service, questioning the presence of remuneration. During the wars of the successors, we also see the emergence of military contracts and mechanisms that indicate the arrival of a labour market on which the price of military labour was determined. The first Maccabees' rather staccato summary of the conquest of Alexander and the wars of the successors and their descendants ends on a rather pessimistic note, stating that evils on earth were multiplied. From a military historical perspective, this assessment is probably not an exaggeration. In the Hellenistic age, warfare had become so prominent that the militaristic ethos, spearheaded by the various Hellenistic kings, came to pervade Hellenistic society in all its facets. The key military developments were notable advances in military technology and strategy, resulting in highly efficient armies, as well as a tremendous increase in the frequency of battle, fought all year round, and an increase in the size of armies, resulting in an unprecedented number of soldiers active across the Mediterranean. These developments have been associated with the nature of Hellenistic kingship. As you can see from this definition of Basileia, provided by the pseudo-lexicon, the king was in the first place a military figure. Both his royal legitimacy and his personal survival were intrinsically tied up with his military prowess and persona. In order to preserve his position and authority, the Hellenistic king was therefore required to engage in at least the pretense of military success. This required an army, and, as powerfully argued by Austin, such an army's upkeep required constant engagement as well as funds. Thus, it duly dictated a policy of constant territorial expansion and subsequent exploitation. However, the link between military prowess and royal legitimacy and survival, as well as subsequent expansionary drift, was not a feature reserved for the Hellenistic period proper. Instead, it finds its roots in the rise of Philip II of Macedonia, who came to power in 359, when his brother Perdiccas had fallen in battle, alongside 4,000 Macedonian forces. The kingdom then obtained by Philip was in a fickle state, beset on all sides of the compass by hostile neighbours intent on expansion. Internally, rivals for the Macedonian throne also rapidly made themselves known. However, by the time of Philip's death in 336, he had successfully incorporated all neighbouring areas into the Macedonian kingdom and was the de facto king of the Greek mainland. Much of his success has been attributed to his diplomatic skill and strategic political interventions, but his extremely swift muster of an army, instrumental in warding off both internal and external threats, and his ensuing military reforms were surely the crucial factor of the Macedonian success. Philip's military reforms are often framed in terms of technological changes that resulted in the highly efficient and deadly Macedonian phalanx, the emergence of which significantly affected the way in which war was fought. Briefly stated, Philip's infantry reforms comprised the introduction of a lighter cuirass and shield, while the short hoplite sword was replaced with a longer spear known as the sarissa. These changes in equipment gave rise to an altogether more mobile army, which could fight at long range. Unlike the armies of the classical polis, furthermore, Philip also had access to a highly trained cavalry, whose charge and so-called wedge formation quickly fostered the Macedonian cavalry's deadly reputation. More importantly, perhaps, Philip is said to have subjected his soldiers to an intense and continuous training regime, as a result of which his army formed a strong contrast to the armies of the Greek cities, manned by seasonal and, dare I say, amateur soldiers. Philip, furthermore, also heavily invested in the development of military technology, of which advances in siege warfare, a trend begun in 4th century Sicily, is the best example. Such technological advances continued throughout the Hellenistic age, ranging from widespread use of elephants to the introduction of heavy polyreme ships, and leading to increasingly efficient armies. Philip's reforms are much discussed and generally seen as a critical factor behind Macedonia's rapidly achieved dominance. However, as argued most prominently by Ellis, Philip's principal military innovation was simply the expansion of his army. And expand he did. As can be seen from the table of reported troop numbers, during his reign, Philip at least tripled the size of his army, from the impressively and rapidly mustered 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry during the first year of his rule, to the 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry present at Chaeronea in 338. This continuous expansion of armies continued during the Hellenistic period. The numbers provided by the historiographical sources, incredible as they may seem, are generally considered reliable, and even single generals commanded armies whose numbers make those of earlier years pale in contrast. For instance, Antigonus is said to have brought 36,500 men to face Eumenes, who commanded a force of 35,000. In later years, the numbers increase even further. According to Polybius, for instance, Antiochus III fields an army of 62,000 men against Ptolemy IV. We shall turn to the reasons behind this expansion in military participation later. For now, it seems that with armies such as these roaming the ancient Mediterranean, the author of the Maccabees was probably right in claiming that there was a considerable amount of misery. And yet, however grim the picture painted by the presence of near-constant and increasingly efficient warfare may seem, the Hellenistic age was not all tumultuous and disruptive. Quite the contrary. As argued by Davies, the world which the Romans overran had advanced economically well beyond that which Alexander knew. In terms of the economy, the chief developments were increased monetization, likely spurred on by the military payments in coin, a marked increase in trade, higher and specialized production, and a general drift towards the integration of markets. Of course, not all economies were affected by these developments, and regional economies in areas such as Crete or Delos display many continuities. However, on the broad scale, the economic advances appear clear, and they have led Bindlev to characterize the Hellenistic economies as proto-capitalist in nature. The mention of capitalism, of course, takes us straight to the heart of the debate on the nature of the ancient economy. This debate was long framed along the lines of a stark dichotomy, which simply asked whether the ancient economy was a market or capitalist economy or not. These discussions, however, have reached somewhat of a stalemate, and new approaches, such as those advocated by the new institutional economics, have gained traction. Rather recently, however, Harris and Lewis have called for a restatement of the terms. While acknowledging the work of the new institutional economics, which has provided valuable insights into the ancient world's economic performance, they argue that attention should once more be directed to the market, this time not simply asking whether it existed or not, but rather what types of price-setting markets there were. This approach is indeed more flexible and will cover differences in economic behavior as well as patterns of potential market exchange within largely substantivist economies, thus not succumbing to a formalist view altogether. Of all types of price-setting markets, the labor market, on which the price of wages is determined in line with supply and demand, is arguably the most important one. For those who see the economy as embedded, the emergence of wage labor is one of the prerequisites of the economy's disembedment, and thus for the evolution to market economies. For formalists, on the other hand, the large-scale presence of wage labour signals a high division of labour, and thus an advanced stage in economic development. The importance of wage labour to the interpretation of the nature of the ancient economy is recognised, but the debate wouldn't be the debate if its extent and existence in the ancient world weren't fiercely disputed. For Moses Finley, the answer was straightforward. Wage labour did not exist in the ancient world, and he describes it as an historically sophisticated latecomer, which would have required a leap in conceptual thinking that the ancient world simply did not manage to take. The leap he refers to is a distinction between labour and labour power, the latter being the human capacity to work, which is measured in time and commodified under the wage-labour relationship. Instead, Finley asserts that the ancient world remained a slave society, in which goods and services were either produced in the household or through the labour of slaves, who filled the specialist positions that would have required a high division of labour. Thus, in his view, wage labour remained the sole prerogative of capitalism. Of course, proponents of the existence of wage labour in the ancient world also exist. In his catalogue of attested mistoi, wages, in Athens, Loomis, for instance, concludes not only that wage labour existed, but also that classical Athens were a labour market. His views were endorsed by Harrison Lewis, who likewise based their conclusion on the attestation of wages for builders, and adduced a further example of doctors. Such interpretations, however, beg the question as to whether the mere presence of a mistos equates the development of the wage-labour relationship proper, or merely represents a form of reimbursement. In addition, it can be asked whether these instances in fact occurred on a large enough scale to have had significant impact on the dominant economic structures. A nuanced view of the wage-labour relationship in ancient Greece is offered by the St. Croix. While in agreement with Finley's view that the ancient world was a slave-based society, in which the propertied classes derived their surplus mainly from unfree labour, he allows for the existence of the wage-labour relationship in certain contexts. Nonetheless, he also considers its economic impact negligible, since it was infrequent and casual, small in scale, and rarely acquired on the market. The often cited example of the workers attested in the building accounts of the temple at Eleusis, dated to the 320s, illustrates this point. Building activity was not constant in the ancient world, and its fairly incidental nature meant that competition for the workers' labour power, and thus for the development of the market, is unlikely to have occurred. This is reflected in the unskilled workers' wages, which were relatively low. Those of the skilled workers were slightly higher, but as is the case for other highly skilled professions, these workers were active in small number. The sale of labour power in such circumstances is therefore not necessarily indicative of a wider trend in the labour relations. Demand for labour did not always occur, and the labourers could not make a livelihood simply through the sale of their labour power. Examples of wage labour such as this one should therefore perhaps be seen as incidental, and perhaps as not indicative of the development of the wage-labour relationship at all. Wage labour, then, should be defined as work performed on the basis of a contract between a worker or group of workers and an employer, on which the employer remunerates in the form of a wage. This wage can be paid out in coin or kind. The workers should not be coerced into work in any way, and the price of the wages should not be arbitrary, but rather based on market exchange. For a labour relation to be characterised as wage labour, the worker therefore needs to sell his or her capacity to work voluntarily on the market. Inevitably, high demand for labour tends to increase the price of this labour, a mechanism which is amplified if workers are able to bargain for better conditions of work collectively. When a labour market exists, wages are therefore expected to increase. The one sphere of activity singled out by the St. Croix as a meaningful instance of wage labour in the ancient world is paid military service. As said, this occurred on an unprecedented scale in the royal armies of the late classical and early Hellenistic period. In order to see whether the soldiers fit the categorization of wage labour, we should therefore look at the following elements. namely the terms of initial enlistment, asking specifically whether soldiers joined the army on a voluntary basis or were conscripted, and whether their free status was preserved in the ensuing terms of service. We should ask about the types and extent of remuneration available, and finally, whether we can speak of a military labour market, characterised by competition among employers and rising wages. The aforementioned rapid expansion of the Macedonian army under Philip was achieved by opening up military service to several categories of soldiers, and by facilitating enlistments through the provision of armour and equipment for the common troops, and land for those serving in the elite divisions. As we shall see, the bulk of the army consisted of conscript troops, but those who voluntarily enlisted are attested across divisions. Due to the intensive demands of training and campaigning, the soldiers were required for longer than just the military season, and appear to all have received remuneration. The rapid muster of 359 was likely achieved through conscription. While little is known about Macedonian mobilization at the time, and it is largely dependent on the identification of an Alexander mentioned in the fragment of Anaximenes of Lampsakos, the presence of the 4,000 men who died in battle alongside Philip's predecessor indicates that some method of mobilization must have been in place. It is generally thought that this was done by Polis in Lower Macedonia and by Ethnos in Upper Macedonia. However, as Macedonian expansion continued, it appears that peoples from subjugated areas were readily incorporated into the Macedonian army. Because they are treated in much the same way as the Macedonians in the armies of both Philip and Alexander, it is likely that they were likewise conscripted. By ignoring potential ideological barriers and allowing these subjugated people to serve, as well as removing individuals' financial impediments to enlistment, Philip thus significantly expanded the pool of manpower from which he could recruit in these early years. His successful campaigns and strategic diplomatic interventions in the Greek mainland added a further group of soldiers which could be conscripted by proxy. As he became de facto hegemon of the Thessalian League in 352, he was in charge of the League's military matters. This provided him with access to the Thessalian troops, of which the highly skilled cavalry was an important addition. While the specifics of these troops' enlistment are unknown, it is likely that it occurred along the same lines as the muster of Greek troops after the establishment of the Common Peace in 338, the details of which are preserved in the epigraphic record. The oath sworn by the individual members of the alliance stipulates that they were not to act against the kingdom of Philip and his descendants, and that they were to supply troops when called on by the hegemon. While in theory any one polis could call for aid upon the perception of a breach of the agreements made, the request had to be accepted by Philip. In practice, as argued by Perlman, the agreement was therefore a unilateral alliance dressed in Greek diplomatic language, by which Philip could call on troops when required. These Greeks first appear in the Macedonian army in 334, and they continue in Alexander's campaign until their dismissal, along with the Thessalian cavalry 4 years later. While the service of these troops was not directly enforced by Philip, they nonetheless form part of the non-voluntary divisions, insofar as they were likely conscripted on the polis level. However, the Macedonian army's willingness to incorporate as many men as possible is also reflected in the ready acceptance and enlistment of troops denoted by the historiographical sources as Misthophoroi, mercenaries, or rather soldiers who enlisted of their own free will in exchange for pay. According to Diodorus, this began after Philip's acquisition of the mines near Crenides, the exploitation of which led to the recruitment of a large force of such troops. And indeed, these troops make their appearance in the sources from this date onwards. However, while it is tempting to see only these Misthophoroi as potential wage labourers within the Macedonian army, voluntary enlistment and pay is also attested in divisions not described as mercenary contingents in the primary sources. Importantly, such troops are found amongst the elite divisions, and so in a somewhat pejorative discussion of the composition of Philip's companion cavalry, Theopompus reveals the presence of non-Macedonian and thus non-conscripts in their ranks, arguing that his companions had converged from many a place, some from this very land, some from Thessaly, and others from the rest of Greece. And non-Macedonians indeed continue to be attested in the companion cavalry throughout the source material. While opening up service in the Macedonian army and aided Philip in his rapid expansion, enlistment had to be incentivized. For those enlisting in the companion cavalry, this incentive consisted of the donation of land, which is securely attested from the time of Philip, but may have been an older Macedonian custom. Theopompus, again, comments that the companions, who at that time numbered no more than 800, enjoyed the fruits of no less land than the 10,000 Greeks who owned the best and most territory. The size of land allotted, described by Theopompus, is probably an exaggeration, but the fragment confirms the landholding status of the companions. An inscription from Cassandreia offers more insight into the granting of land to military personnel. In this decree, dated to 316 BC, the successor king Cassander confirms the land grants formerly given by Philip and Alexander. Without now going into the complications and interesting implications of the confirmation of this grant, the decree shows that Philip allotted land to a certain Polemocritus and to his son Koinos, while Alexander later granted land on the same conditions to a certain Ptolemaios. Given the common use of the names attested here, it is difficult to ascertain these individuals' identities, but Koinos is identified by Haeckel as a high-ranking commander who may have held command already in the final years of Philip's reign. Koinos is of course a Macedonian, but the apparent settlement of non-Macedonians, such as the Cretan Nearchus, who is described as from Amphipolis, indicates a similar process for import companions. Initial bestowals of land may have been made in order to satisfy the potential prerequisites of land ownership for those willing to join the companion cavalry. On the eve of the Asiatic campaign, however, Alexander reportedly inquired into the financial status of his companions and subsequently handed them rewards, to one a farm, to another a village, to yet another the revenue of some hamlet or harbour. The variety of these gifts indicates that by this stage, the bestowal of land acted as a financial incentive. It should also be noted that as conquest continued and more land became available, such awards were also handed out to lower-ranking soldiers. Thus, these grants were both an incentive and a necessary reward, which facilitated recruitment, again from a larger group of talented individuals. A similar mechanism is detectable in the enlistment of common soldiers. While in the classical polis, soldiers were, at least in theory, required to procure their own armour and equipment, it seems that Philip provided these to all soldiers who enlisted. With the financial restriction to military service and enlistment thus removed, Philip again enlarged the pool from which he could muster. It appears that this practice continued under Alexander, during whose campaign several references to the provision of armour are attested. Finally, monetary incentives were of course provided to the Missophoroi who enlisted, as said when access to the mines near Crenidus allowed for wages to be paid and increases in minting efforts appear in the numismatic record. However, while wages are predominantly associated with mercenary troops, that does not mean conscript forces did not receive them. For Philip, the provision of wages to all soldiers of his army is only hinted at. For instance, in the Stratagems, Polyaenus describes an incident in which soldiers demanded their pay. This event takes place in a gymnasium, which has been said to imply that the soldiers here referred to were Macedonians. Justin relates an encounter between Philip and the Scythian king Athias, who had borrowed Macedonian soldiers, and Philip reprimands Athias for not having paid them their rations nor their wages. However, the intense nature of Macedonian military service under Philip, which required year-round availability, meant that provision of some monetary incentive was not only probable, but likely also required to foresee the soldiers in their daily upkeep. These circumstances are exacerbated during the lengthy campaign of Alexander, and here wages are securely attested for so-called Mr. Foroi and conscript troops alike. In Arian, for instance, we hear of Macedonian soldiers whose ranks are referred to in relation to their pay grade, and so we hear of a double pay man or a 10-stater man. Similarly, during the dismissal of the Allied and thus conscript forces in 330, Arian reports that their outstanding wages were paid. This dismissal of these troops marks an important shift in the military-labor relations apparent in the army of Alexander. For while the army he set out with in 334 was for the most part the army assembled by Philip, and thus largely composed of remunerated but nonetheless conscripted forces, many of these troops transitioned into voluntary soldiers. The reform is described by all historiographical sources in varying detail. While Plutarch merely states that homesick soldiers could go home, a different picture emerges in other sources. Thus, according to Diodorus, Arrian, and Curtius, the reform consisted of the dismissal of the Allied forces, allegedly because the mission for which they had been recruited, the defeat of Darius, had been accomplished. Evidently, this reform concerned the troops supplied under the terms of the common peace. Demobilization, however, was not the end of it. As reported in the sources, Alexander allowed these troops to re-enlist if they wished, and he incentivized to do so with a significant bonus. Arrian claims a large number did so, which is confirmed by the troops' appearance in later battles across the sources. Here, therefore, we see the transition of troops that carried out enforced military service to the status of troops engaged in free military labor, on which they had embarked voluntarily. Perhaps spurred on by the exceptional demands of the campaign, the service of conscript forms, particularly the Macedonians, displayed voluntary characteristics too. While Alexander's men technically had the civic duty to follow him, collective refusal would turn the tables. This is exactly what happened at Opis in 324, when the troops refused to march further eastwards. Alexander convinced them to continue the expedition through additional rewards, a practice he regularly employed to keep up the men's morale. The army therefore consisted of both voluntary and conscript troops. The latter category, however, increasingly began to resemble the former, either through a change in their military status or by the changing character of the relationship between king and soldier, which became increasingly based on negotiation. Thus, the majority of soldiers in the armies of Philip and Alexander were unfree military laborers. Among these, however, we find free military laborers in the guise of both Mr. Foroi and those soldiers who voluntarily enlisted in the elite divisions. Nonetheless, all members appear to have received remuneration for service, both in kind and coin. This remuneration performed a dual function of enticing volunteers to enlist and as a way to sustain troops that were continuously kept under arms. The soldiers therefore bear the hallmarks of the wage-labor relationship, free enlistment and remuneration, and thus provide an important step towards the emergence of military wage labor proper in the armies of the successors. Much like the political situation upon Philip's accession dictated the rapid assembly of an army, the turbulent years following the sudden death of Alexander in 323 and the ensuing decades of warfare between his successors in pursuit of a stable and legitimate territorial base forced them into the large-scale recruitment of voluntary troops. Even more so than Philip and Alexander, their authority and later royal legitimacy was based on their military prowess, and survival dependent on their ability to raise armies. As we shall see, these soldiers were mobile and had to be incentivized with increasingly big monetary rewards. Of course, some of the successors had conscript forces at their disposal. Perdiccas, for instance, was in control of the soldiers that remained in Babylon, detachments of which he had sent in aid of supporters, such as Eumenes. Yet, Eumenes still had to resort to calling on further conscript soldiers from his satrapy. Through the revival of the common peace in 303, Demetrius and Antigonus could muster conscript troops via the Greek polis. Those in relatively stable territories could muster from their subjects. Antipater, for instance, could collect soldiers from the Macedonian heartland, yet he is said to have failed to muster sufficient troops for the Lamian War in 322. Bosworth attributes the difficulty of gathering new Macedonian recruits to the depletion of Macedonian manpower by the extended campaigns of Alexander and Philip. Ptolemy's Egyptian forces are first attested in 312, but it should be noted that these were only used in times of pressing need and levied on an ad hoc basis. Ptolemy's standing army and the elite divisions, on the other hand, comprised voluntary recruits. For the successors, conscript forces, while available, were thus problematic in terms of the low numbers in which they were available for levy, and preference appears to have been given to the professionals who enlisted voluntarily. The important role that voluntary forces would come to play in the successor wars is signalled by Ptolemy's first action upon his arrival in Egypt. Finding 8,000 talents in the treasury, he immediately exploited these for the collection of voluntary troops. Similarly, Antigonus, when making his bid for rule over Asia in 319, did not expect to run into problems of manpower, since Asia could provide pay without end. The recruitment of voluntary forces, therefore, becomes a running theme throughout the narrative of the successor wars. Where numbers are recorded, the composition of the successor armies reflects the growing prominence of such troops. In each case, the proportion of voluntary troops significantly outweighs that of conscripts. Thus, Antigonus, for example, commanded a total force of 57,100 men, of whom 39,600 were volunteers in 321. Demetrius' army in 314 comprised 10,000 volunteers, in addition to 2,900 conscripts. Incentive structures continued along the same lines as those attested under Philip and Alexander, and so we continue to hear of the provision of armor and land grants. Of course, the major incentive offered came in the form of monetary wages, supplements with occasional bonuses, the extent of which is reflected in the successors' reported expenses from the recruitment of troops. These costs can be illustrated by Antigonus' reported military expenditure. In 319, he seized 600 talents on their way to Macedonia in order to pay his troops. 3 years later, he collected 10,000 talents as a treasury for the same purpose. 1,000 talents of which he gave to Aristodemus for the gathering of troops in the Peloponnese. And he is said to have at all times carried an emergency fund of 3,000 talents. These numbers are astonishingly high, but perhaps seem reflected closely in the successors' minting efforts. The increased prevalence of voluntary and paid military service went hand in hand with the emergence of military contracts, in which remuneration, legal statuses, and the duration of service are specified. We have a handful of such documents dated to the period. A decree found at the military stronghold of Theangela, near Halicarnassus, dated to around 309, can serve as an example. It records the agreement made between a certain Eupolemus, who was either a general in the service of Cassander or had defected already in order to pursue a career as a local dynast, and the commanders of volunteer forces with the city of Theangela, seemingly at the end of hostilities. The decree specifies that the soldiers of both sides are able to leave without paying export taxes on their possessions. Amnesty is to be granted to those who deserted to the opposing side, and those soldiers who wish to remain in the service of the commander Eupolemus are to receive a bonus, whereas those previously serving the defeated Theangelans are encouraged to enlist. Such provisions ensure the continued voluntary nature of these soldiers' military service and indicate that enlistment occurred for a set period of time only. The fact that the men were allowed to leave their current employers, and indeed even to join the ranks of the opposing army without judgment, shows that this form of military service had become increasingly institutionalized. At the same time, the soldier's ability to leave and enlist with a different employer left room for negotiation. The importance of this aspect in the relationship between king and army can neatly be illustrated by Eumenes' ghost counsel. Allegedly, after a vision of Alexander came to him, but in reality in response to the soldier's wavering support, this council, supposedly overseen by Alexander, served as an institutionalized space for negotiation and deliberation between Eumenes and his men. That the successors were ready to negotiate is illustrated by events between Antigonus and his army when campaigning in Gaza, and he offered the army the option to press on or withdraw to Syria. The army opted for the latter course of action, and Antigonus obliged. Similarly, when his soldiers became critical of him during the demanding march from Susa in 317, he responded by donating horses and additional gifts, thereby regaining the men's goodwill. At times, however, better options were offered by different employers, and when the soldiers said leave means leave, they meant it. For instance, the commander of Antigonus, Alexander, defected to Cassander in exchange for the position of general. Cassander offered to reward him in accordance with his merits, and Diodorus argues that Alexander deserted, because that for which he had made war against Cassander was being granted to him. Thus, according to Diodorus, Alexander was motivated by career considerations and presumably higher pay rather than political allegiance. Thus, the Successor Wars created a situation in which a number of employers, the kings and commanders, competed for the service of soldiers who keenly negotiated the price of their labor, and whose terms of service preserved their mobility and even the option of enlistment with a different commander. Noticeably, both employers and soldiers appear to have been acutely aware of the new nature of the military relationship. Given the soldiers' apparent response to financial rather than political or moral incentives, any successor in need of troops had to match and preferably go beyond the offers of his rivals. The conditions for the emergence of a labour market were thus established. Eumenes' recruitment of additional forces after having been granted access to the treasury illustrates this process. According to Diodorus, he sent out recruiters, establishing a notable rate of pay, who mustered soldiers from across the Mediterranean. The pay being worthy of consideration, 12,000 men are said to have reported of their own accord, among whom many Greeks. That service in these armies was an attractive option to the Greeks is illustrated by Diodorus' assessment of the declaration of the Lamian War. The alleged reason was the desire for restored Greek independence. The real reason, however, was the assembly's high proportion of men who had become accustomed to make their living through war. The offer of higher wages was not only a key incentive for the enlistment of new recruits, but it was also used as a weapon to tempt soldiers away from competitors and put them at a numerical disadvantage. And so in 302, 3,000 of Lysimachus' men went over to Antigonus, who paid the wages still owed to them and honoured them with gifts. A more clear-cut example stems from the year 317. While Antigonus was in pursuit of Eumenes, the latter reportedly convinced some of Antigonus' men to change sides by winning their consent with money. Ptolemy too employed similar methods. He would pay those who would change side from Antigonus 2 mina each of the common soldiers and a talent to those in the position of command. In an ordinary context, these acts would have constituted desertion, and the employers at times appear to have interpreted them as such. In this instance, some of the men who went over to Ptolemy were captured by Antigonus and tortured. However, this appears to have been a deviation from the norm. For instance, upon capturing a group of soldiers who attempted to desert to Antigonus in 320, Eumenes is said to have put the commanders to death, but to have shown clemency to the captured soldiers if they re-enlisted with him. Presumably for purely pragmatic reasons, each enlisted soldier could make a difference. The awareness that this was ultimately the soldiers' desire for monetary gain that inspired loyalty is also reflected in events surrounding the potential desertion of the Ptolemaic commander Athenagoras. Here, after receiving an offer from Demetrius, Athenagoras is pretended to accept, but at the same time disclosed it to his superiors. The latter responded by awarding him public honors as well as a bonus of 5 talents, allegedly in order to inspire loyalty towards the demos from the other men who were paid soldiers. Continuous competition among the various successors for the service of these men, not fought out on the battlefield, but by opening purses, naturally led to increases in the price paid. This increase is reflected in the sparse numerical evidence available. While precise quantification of salaries is impossible, contemporary epigraphic evidence suggests that the price of military labor in the successor armies had increased significantly in comparison to those accorded to soldiers of contemporary civic militias. This is certainly indicated by the qualitative evidence. I've already mentioned Diodorus' assessment of the declaration of the Lamian War, but likewise, the philosopher Theophrastus, who offers an entertaining series of character sketches, describes an Athenian who boasts of the money he made while on campaign with Alexander, and the numerous privileges now offered to him by Antipater. In an idyll by Theocritus, a heartbroken man in need of a distraction is encouraged to enlist in the army of Ptolemy II, who is called a good paymaster. The trope of the Milles Gloriosus is indeed well established, and this is reflected in the sparse evidence on pay rates. The alliance between Antigonus and Demetrius and the Greeks, for instance, required the provision of troops, but allowed for payment to be provided in lieu of them. The following rates are preserved: 50 drachmae for a cavalryman, 20 drachmae for a hoplite, 10 drachmae a day for a light-armed soldier, and 10 drachmae for a sailor. The high rates mentioned could, of course, be explained as a deterrent against not sending men, but parallels for such agreements indicate that the money was destined to cover the cost. For instance, in the Hellenica, Xenophon describes the agreements made between Sparta and her allies in 382, which specify that members could forego the supply of troops in exchange for 3 obols or 4.3 Attic drachmas per foot soldier per day, and 4 times that rate for a cavalryman. A fine for failing to provide either is listed separately as 1 stater per day for each missing man. The separate mention of a fine suggests that in such agreements, the rate mentioned are aimed at covering the costs, rather than intended as a deterrent against not sending troops. Similarly, wages for citizen soldiers in garrison duty in the 3rd century are recorded in an agreement between the Ionian cities of Theos and Kyrbyzos. Here, the specified demands are 4 Alexandrian drachmas for a commander, who, by the way, is to own possessions worth 4 talents, and 1 drachma for common troops. While these may only have covered rations, the difference in the amount is nonetheless vast. The available evidence does not allow us to see such quantitative changes in the price of military labor in the individual successor armies, but comparison with the wages attested shows that prices offered by the successors had soared. Even if the attested wages of citizen soldiers only covered rations or other expenses, the difference is substantial. Soldiers in the civic armies, however, did not serve voluntarily and had no negotiating power. Competition for their service, furthermore, did not exist as long as the soldiers wanted to stay in their polis community. The high wages awarded by the successor, by contrast, should be taken as a result of the development of a labor market, in which various employers competed over the service of the same pool of soldiers, and in doing so, drove up their price. So I set out to ask whether the soldiers of the royal armies of the late classical and early Hellenistic period can be conceived of as an instance of large-scale wage labor, the existence of which would provide an important model to relate the military and economic developments that engulfed the ancient world in the period under consideration. Wage labor is much discussed in debates on the ancient economy, and it has emerged as an important element of the free status of the laborer, the availability of remuneration, and the presence of a market on which the price of this remuneration is determined. These elements were discussed in terms of modes of initial enlistment and subsequent terms of service and remuneration. From this, it emerged that the hallmarks of a wage-labor relationship were present in the armies of Philip and Alexander, but that soldiers can only be seen as wage laborers proper during the wars of the Successors, when we see the emergence of military contracts and market mechanisms that push the price of military labor upwards. Thank you for listening.